The fog over Stillwater Pines sat low and heavy enough to feel like a rule. It pressed between the lodgepole trunks and pooled in the roadside ditches, turning the highway into a ribbon of dim pewter that swallowed sound as easily as breath. Sheriff Emery Knox kept her window cracked anyway. Pine resin and cold water and the faint iron of wet soil cut through the thermos smell of old coffee-riding shotgun. She hadn't planned to be sheriff. She was supposed to be a music teacher. That was before elections and retirements and the kind of small-town momentum that nudges you into uniforms you don't remember choosing. Before the call dot, it came at 6:58 a.m., 2 rings and dispatch on the third, voice flat with that careful, practiced calm. Stillwater Pines construction site, East Service Road off Route 41. Contractor dug up a school bus. A bus in the ground should have sounded like a prank, but she knew which one before she turned the cruiser around. Her hand went to the visor, where a sun-faded class photo was tucked, faces barely more than blurs, but still arranged in a memory she could tap without looking. 15 kids and 1 driver who didn't belong to them. 15 names she could recite in alphabetical order because Mrs. Piper had made them sing attendance like scales. Emery had been home that day in May of 1986, sweaty with a mild fever and furious about the bad timing. She'd stared out the window at the bus pulling away, with kids pressing their palms to the glass, promising her they'd bring back stories and fire smoke in their hair. She'd woken from a nap to her mother's hand on her forehead, and this news on the TV, in a country that suddenly knew the name of a town it would never visit. She killed the siren at the forest. Turn off and let the cruiser roll slow into the ruts, tires whispering through wet needles. The contractor's pickup looked ashamed beside the backhoe, both vehicles beaded with mist. Men in hard hats had formed a jittery circle the way small. Towns do when the past steps out of the trees to see how everyone's turned out. "You, Emery?" the foreman asked. He was big in a way that suggested he'd been small once and hadn't forgotten. "We weren't digging for anything but a septic tank. Bucket hit metal. We thought oil drum. Then we saw yellow. Did you touch the interior?" Door popped when the dirt sloughed off. "We opened it and then closed it. That's all." He swallowed. "I've got daughters." The bus crouched in the cut like a guilty animal caught sleeping. What paint the mud hadn't licked away was a dulled sunflower, ribs warped inward from decades of weight. The rear emergency door faced the trench. You could see the hinge had fought the earth and lost, bowed out like a tired jaw. Emery stepped closer and the smell rose. Not rot nothing so straightforward, but a layered breath of clay, mildew, and the plastic sweetness of things that were supposed to last forever. She cataloged automatically. Bluebird body, Oregon plates, long expired, a faint white ghost where a route number used to be. The contractor's bucket had clipped the rear quarter panel. She made a note to have someone measure the scrape so nobody with a lawyer and a theory could accuse anyone of staging. She slid on nitrile gloves and ducked her head through the emergency door. Time had shrunk the aisle. The ceiling had fallen in places, insulation clotted with dirt and root. Seats stood like molars, vinyl split into curls that would pinch if you ran a finger the wrong way. Some buckles still latched, their tongues fat with mud. A cartoon lunchbox lounged on its side under third-row passenger, its hinge furred in white and the sticker worn smooth, except for the smile of a cat that stubbornly refused to fade. On the rear step, a small sneaker lay on its side as if a foot had blossomed right out of it and then thought better of the idea. She moved forward carefully, placing each boot where the frame still sang when you tapped it. At the driver's area, the cracked wheels stared crooked past the empty windshield at the kind of trees that take secrets, the way oceans take bottles. Taped to the dash beneath a gauzed layer of dust was something that made a sound in her throat she didn't release. Elementary teacher handwriting, looping and optimistic, listed names and allergy notes. Beside them, peanut, none, cat's okay signed. At the bottom, in a flourish, Ms. Piper. Across the lower margin, heavy marker cuts had chewed through the paper in a different, sloppier hand. Letters pressed hard enough to dent the vinyl beneath. We never reached Camp Stillwater, Dot. It wasn't. Faded enough to be 40 years old. It wasn't fresh enough to be a joke from this week. The line quality said someone had written it with their arm, braced on a slanted surface, and with an urgency they were trying to hide. Emery stood very still until her breath stopped fogging. The dust dot, she backed out into air that felt 10 degrees colder. The men had drifted back. No one smoked. No one asked questions that would keep them up later. She sealed the scene with tape and cones, and the kind of posture that tells people you will personally bite them if they duck the line. She called the state lab, the medical examiner, even though there were no bodies. Criminal investigations. The one journalist in county who could spell quiet and keep it. She said the words, possible evidence, 3 times into 3 different phones, so the recorder would have breadcrumbs to follow when someone asked why she hadn't said them. When she was done, she stood at the trench rim and watched mist gather in the bent metal like the bus was slowly drinking from a bottomless cup. It would have made sense to feel nothing. It would have made more sense to feel only anger. Instead, there was a thin thread in her chest, tightening, a pull like a compass needle waking up. She could hear what Mrs. Piper had sounded like saying. Each name. She could hear the driver's voice she did not know telling them to stay in their seats. She could hear the way the laughter must have stuck for a few seconds longer than it should have when the bus made a turn it had never taken before. The first state unit arrived with tires, gritting gravel and doors popping in unison. Emery briefed them without looking at her notes. We protect the story first, she said. No one gets to write it for us this time. A crime scene tech with square glasses and steady hands came up with an equipment case and a look that asked for permission, and promised not to waste it. She nodded him in. The rest she left to their checklists. Back in her vehicle, she didn't start the engine. The fog had started to burn into sight lines. Shafts of light sketched diagonals between trees. She could leave, go straight to the archives, pull the box that had been waiting for her since she was 11, and the world decided that neat resolutions looked better on paper than in people's lives. Or she could sit for 1 minute with her hand on the wheel and let the past be heavy without trying to rearrange it into something polite. She chose the minute. Then she drove. The Raven County Records building had always smelled like floor polish and wet cardboard. Ceiling fans turned slow enough to scold you for being in a hurry. The clerk on duty was 2 years younger than the case and had a way of moving that, suggested she could bring you the wrong file and apologize in a manner that made you feel you'd asked for it. Emery gave her the number and watched the woman look surprised that the catalog still knew where to point. The box was heavier than it looked. That was true of a lot of things from 1986. She carried it to a side table, slid the lid, and breathed in the papery hollow that rises off rooms where people have tried to keep the past flat. Photos, Xeroxes of photos, copy of a copy class lists that spidered into unreadability at the margins. A driver's application Pete Hollis, references that said nothing, a hire date too close to the trip. A volunteer form for a last-minute substitute no one remembered meeting. Asked her with an address that had since been swallowed by brambles and a developer's dream. A stamped conclusion she could feel through the page before she read it. No evidence of foul play. She set that piece aside like it was hot dot. There were the personal item lists, Walkman, 2 tapes, Phil Collins, sketchbook with horse stickers, inhaler, camera with 1 roll unshot, and a map to Camp Stillwater circled. In bright pen along a route she'd biked and run and driven hundreds of times since. Her index finger hovered over the fork, where the old logging road split from the paved one. At that bend, the trees tightened. If a large, friendly yellow animal had turned its head and wandered right instead of left, would anyone have seen it happen? Would anyone have believed it? She was bracing to close the box when her phone hummed on the table twice. Unknown number, local exchange. She answered because dispatch taught her that unanswered calls ferment into emergencies. Sheriff Knox? A man's voice, wind moving. Over the microphone. I'm down by the East Cove with my wife. We fish mornings. There's someone on the rocks. She's not right. She says she's 11. Where are you exactly? Old trail below the ranger platform. She's barefoot. Clothes look wrong. We gave her water. She asked if the bus is here yet. The box lid slid back on its rails without her telling her hand to move. Keep her warm. Don't ask her questions you don't have to. I'm on my way. She drove the east loop faster than posting aloud, because that's what sirens are. 4. The lake made its own weather. 1 degree colder on the skin, 1 inch shorter in breath. The couple stood where granite steps down into water that never remembers summer. Between them, a woman sat with her knees hugged to her chest beneath. A jacket 2 sizes too big. Her hair looked grown in the dark. Her skin had the translucence of someone who had forgotten sunlight for too long. And her eyes, Emery knew those eyes, like she knew the feel of a piano key under her finger. Green wide, questioning with a kind of patience that children have before adults teach it to look like something else. Tessa Quinn, Emery said, but not like a question. The woman blinked. A tear formed without spilling. You got taller, she said, voice a rasp against new air. And your hair isn't in braids. Emery could feel the ground tilt, a slow pivot that your stomach notices before your brain catches up. She crouched to bring her face level. Up close, the woman's age slid and dodged. The hands were older, the mouth was older. The eyes refused to be anything but the eyes of a kid who had sat 2 rows up and 1 seat over, who had traded music class pencils for cinnamon gum. I'm going to take you to the hospital, Emery said. You're safe, I promise. They said nobody would remember, Tessa whispered. They said the lake wasn't ready for us, and we had to wait. Who said that? The question came gentle but quick. A man got on at the fork. He had a beard and a hat like Sunday, but it wasn't Sunday. The driver knew him. The new teacher did too. She swallowed. We didn't reach camp. Emery pulled the jacket closer around Tessa's shoulders and felt under the cuff the fray of something plastic, a hospital bracelet that wasn't a hospital bracelet, the kind you win at a birthday party arcade and never take off until summer. Forces you to. It had letters scratched into it with a needle or a pin. Taze. The rest had worn away. In the R. Fluorescent lights tried and failed to make everything ordinary. Nurses did their ballet of vitals and blankets, whispered the shorthand. Of trauma, it says we will pretend it's routine, because pretending is how we don't cry at work. Tessa faded in and out, anchoring on the same phrases like stepping stones in a stream. We never reached camp. They said the clocks were wrong. They gave us new names. She was 39, if the calendar had anything to say about it. If her mind got a vote, she was 11 and waiting for a counselor to call cabin assignments. Emery stood outside the room with a paper cup of water she didn't drink. She could feel the old files flexing in her satchel, like pages trying to breathe. On a chair against the corridor wall, she set down the cup, opened the bag, and pulled the class photo she kept on her visor. She smoothed it. The laminate had bubbled long ago. She tapped each face in order and then stopped and tapped one twice. A girl with a calico headband and a stubborn tilt to her chin. A nurse touched Emery's elbow. She gave a name, the nurse said, like names were miracles, which, in the right rooms, they are. She says she's Tessa Quinn, and she asks if you still live on County Road C, where the mailbox leans. Emery smiled without showing teeth, because that's how you hold your face together when something tries to open it. Tell her the mailbox is even worse now. DNA will take a minute, the nurse added in the professional future tense, leaving space for doubt without inviting it to move in. But if you ask me, Sheriff, I won't ask, I know. The nurse nodded once, like they had agreed to share a secret without speaking it. When Emery stepped back into the room, Tessa was staring at the ceiling tiles like they were a sky she could trust. Emery pulled a chair close and sat. Do you remember the bus ride? She asked, keeping her voice low so the question could sneak past the part of the brain that flinches. Just the beginning, Tessa said. The driver didn't talk. He wasn't our guy. It was a woman who looked like a teacher, but her shoes were wrong. He stopped at the fork, and a man came in without asking. He said the lake wasn't ready. He said we had to wait. He said, if we were quiet, we would be safe. Her eyes shifted to the window. We were quiet. We were so good at it, we forgot how to stop. Emery could feel the thread in her chest pull taut, pointing somewhere the map had never bothered to print. She reached into her satchel and placed the visor photo on the tray table. Tessa's hand came out from the blanket like a gray moth, hovered, and landed on the glossy paper. She found herself and laughed once, the sound small and startled. I had bangs, she said, like she was telling a joke no one had heard in a long time. Then she tapped the boy's face. Caleb. He drew cars all over his math worksheets. Miss Piper pretended to be mad. Another face. Marcy. She sang like church, even when it wasn't. And me, Emery said, touching the lower corner, where she leaned into the frame, as if poised to run out of it. I was homesick. I wanted to die about it. That's lucky, Tessa said softly, without malice. The words landed and didn't move. Outside, the lake shook itself into noon wind. Inside, monitors blinked their soft math. Emery stayed until Tessa's breathing settled into the kind that lets a body rest without falling. When she stood, she felt taller and older, and 11 all at once. On her way past the nurse's station, she signed the consent to hold Tessa under protective status until a judge could be woken politely and brought the fax dot in the parking lot. The air tasted like rain that had changed its mind. She leaned on the cruiser door and dialed her deputy. Lock down the site, she said. No one in except State Lab. I want the dash photographed, exactly as found. There's a note. It's not from 86. You want me to call archives? He asked. Pull case file 12 to 86? I already did. We're going to need more than paper this time. She looked across the lot toward the old Ranger platform. Roofline slumped like a tired shoulder. And we're going to need to ask questions we didn't ask before. Like what? Like who bought Birch Hollow Youth Fellowship in '84 and why they used 3 shell companies to hide a family name. There was a beat of silence long, enough to admit new weather into a conversation. You thinking Ashby? He asked. I'm thinking we stop pretending this was an accident and start treating it like a plan. She ended the call and slid behind the wheel. The keys felt a little heavier, and the road out of the lot looked like it was waiting to introduce her to where it had been all along. The bus was still in the ground. The note on the dash still said what it said. A woman with the wrong number, of years in her eyes, had asked if the mailbox still leaned and laughed at her own bangs and told the truth, like it was a contraband candy she'd smuggled out under her tongue. Emery put the cruiser in gear. Fog, or what was left of it, lifted in torn curtains off the lake. The trees along the east road leaned in like congregation. She drove toward the archives, toward land records and trust deeds, and the kind of paper that thinks it can forget what wood remembers. The minute hand on the dash clock clicked over, a tiny, handsome sound. And for the first time in 39 years, the story didn't feel closed. It felt like a door someone had wedged with. A coin and a promise, waiting for a hand to pull it open the rest of the way. The records room kept its light low like a church that didn't want to startle anyone. Emery slid past the counter into land and title, where the old blueprint drawers had little brass mouths and the microfilm reader glowed the pale green of school aquariums. Sandra at the desk had a cardigan with elbow patches and a pencil tucked into her bun, and she lifted her eyebrows the way people do when they decide to help before you ask. "You want parcels or people?" Sandra said, "Both," Emery answered. "Start with Birch Hollow Youth Fellowship. Purchase records, any liens, trustee names, all filings from 1984 on." Sandra's hands found the right drawer, like a pianist's finding middle. "See." She pulled deed books that thudded on the counter and rolled a microfilm canister across under her palm. "That place was a church camp back before I moved here," she said. Then it turned private. Then it turned quiet. Quiet was a good word for the kind of thing that sat until it could swallow you. Emery took a seat at the reader and spun the dial until the words swam into a steady line. Deed, transfer of title, Birch Hollow Youth Fellowship to Ashby Conservancy, August 3, 1984. Trustee signature was neat and uninvolved. Gilbert R. Ashby. Mailing address rooted to a Portland law. Firm that had since changed names twice and learned how to say nothing more gracefully. A second filing 6 months later assigned maintenance rights to something called Rook and Elm Holdings. "A holding company for a holding company," Emery murmured. "Matryoshka dolls." Sandra pushed another book over. Tax rolls with a skim. Coat of dust. "Abatement filed," she pointed, nail tapping. Classification changed to educational nonprofit for 5 years. No public programming reported after 86. That's strange. Strange is an improvement over nothing. Emery traced the correspondence log. The Conservancy paid taxes on time, paid utilities in batches through a PO box, and filed no occupancy permits. No inspections logged. If you wanted to rent a place and keep people from wondering what you did there, you might do it exactly like this. She took photos of every page and emailed them to herself with subject lines she'd recognize later when the board asked for documentation. She could hear her deputy, Ross, in her head. Paper doesn't lie. People do. Paper lies all the time, she thought. It just needs more friends to help it. Need anything else while I'm dangerous? Sandra asked. Astor, Emery said. Initial M, last name Asder. Temporary hire through district, spring of 86. I need the address we have, and anyone who bought the parcel after. Sandra's eyebrows climbed again, like they'd stepped on a stair they hadn't seen. I know that one. It's a lot now. Used to be a cottage. Burned down in the early 90s. No rebuild. She keyed it in, turned the screen so Emery could see parcel on the edge of town. Last transfer to a developer who held it as collateral and let Bramble do the landscaping. We have a forwarding from back then to a PO in Tacoma. Nothing. After. Driver, Emery said, flipping a page in the old personnel file. Pete Hollis. Rental on Mill Spur, Space 17. Sandra didn't have to look that one up. Everyone knew Mill Spur, like a family member they didn't invite to holidays. It's an auto salvage now. Emery thanked her, signed the log, and borrowed a portable scanner. She returned 5 minutes later because the machine was as fast as a wet match. She left with her phone full of crooked photos, her bag heavier with copies, and a thin hot thread running along her jaw that meant she was chewing on something without teeth. Mill Spur announced itself by smell before the sign. Oil, rust, the faint ozone pop of a welder spitting blue. The salvage yard owner, A man with a name patch that said Garnet in red thread and knuckles like ironwood knots. Met her at the chain gate. Space 17? He said, "You're about 39. Years too late, Sheriff." He had the voice of someone who'd quit smoking and never forgave himself. What lived there? Hollis. Drank cheap beer and read car manuals like they were scripture. He kept to himself. Drove a Mercury Comet that sounded like a beehive in a coffee can. Garnet squinted toward a row of flattened cars. He left quick after the kids. Went missing. Night move. Didn't turn in the keys. Just slid him under my office door with $50 and a note that said, "Thanks. Anyone pick him up?" Blue van. No windows. Two-tone paint like a church van. Plate started with 7. I remember because I wrote it down for the sheriff back then, and he told me not to get clever. Garnet shrugged. I wasn't trying to. I just didn't like the way the men stood. Not talking, just standing. Men? Driver and one other. Bearded. Hat with a pinch in the crown like my granddad wore to. Sunday fish fry, even though he never went to church. Hats and beards kept repeating like a hymn no one wanted stuck in their head. Emery thanked him and walked the line of crushed metal until she found a square of gravel where Space 17 would have been. Someone had once painted numbers in. White by hand, 13 and 15 still showed ghosted. If you whispered hard enough at the dirt here, would it tell you anything? Dirt was a patient liar. She parked outside the lot that had used to be M. Astor's address and wasn't anything now. Scotch broom and blackberry had knitted themselves into a crown and dared anyone to put hands in. Through the green you could. Just see the rectangle of a foundation and the silver grin of a mail slot still clinging to a rotten door upright. Emery stepped over a low run of fence and moved along the perimeter, looking for what the weather was slowest to take. Under the eaves of a hearth that had become the only geometry left, she found a rust-blind house number curled in on itself like a sleeping insect. Beside it, half buried under leaf fall, the edge of a photo sleeve. She lifted it with the corner of her glove. Empty. Maybe nothing. Maybe a hole where something important used to rest dot back at land and title again, because questions never travel alone. She widened the search. Ashby Conservancy connected to Rook and Elm, which connected to Cedarline Foundation, which connected to a property 29 miles north called Riverview Camp on paper and Riverview Youth Retreat on a brochure no one had ever seen. Filing dates did a stutter step around late spring 1986. Payments continued, but correspondence switched hands. Someone named M. Ashby filed a caretaker waiver. His signature looked practiced and hurried at the same time, a contradiction Emery had learned to trust less than anything. She spread deed copies across a table, nudging corners into a map. Birch Hollow here, Riverview there, the old logging spur like a vein through both. She marked the fork where Tessa had said the bearded man climbed aboard and wrote in the margin, "Fork equals choice made for them." She hated metaphors in police work. They made you feel like the story would be satisfying. She let herself circle the words anyway. Ross called from the site. Background noise said generator, the thin whine of a camera flash charging. We've got the bus tarped and boxed like. You asked, he said. Lab wants to start panel pulls tomorrow. They're grumpy they can't gut it today. Tell them to be grumpy, Emery said. Did you photograph the dash note? In triplicate. You're not going to like it. I already don't. It's not old, he said carefully. No mold growth under the tape edge. No heavy yellowing. The corner lifted easy, like it didn't belong there long. But the paper stock is vintage. Somebody wanted us to read it now and think of then. Which means they came back, Emery said, the words quiet so the notion wouldn't hear them and bolt. Or never left. She took her phone into Tessa's room on silent and sat with the screen face down, so she wouldn't mistake the glow for progress. Tessa slept in pulses, then woke and asked simple questions as if rehearsing belonging. What time is it? What day? Does your mom still make lemon squares? It was the last one that made Emery's throat tighten. Her mother had been gone 7 years, but she answered, like she would have wanted. Sometimes. They had clocks, Tessa said, turning the bracelet at her wrist with the fingertips of the hand that wore it. But they were wrong. Always Tuesday. Sometimes 3 Tuesdays in a row. We were told to be grateful because Tuesdays meant stew. She half laughed. It was always stew. Did you see the outside? Emery asked. Sometimes a sliver. Wood up close, the slat kind that leaves splinters. Smell of sap. Something sweet, like when the trees leak and it gets on your hands and you can't quite wash it off. In winter, there was smoke that wasn't wood. She frowned like the memory had a taste. Sharp. They said it was for cleaning. We had to breathe through our sleeves. Birch Hollow had a lodge, Emery said. Riverview had outbuildings. Did you hear trains? Once a day, near dusk, Tessa said without thinking, and then blinked like she'd surprised herself. A long whistle that made the windows hum. Emery wrote "Whistle Dusk" in the margin of her palm with a ballpoint, the ink spidering where a scar from childhood fell. Are you going to find the room where we put our names? Tessa asked suddenly, eyes bright with a fear she was only now letting into the open. We weren't supposed to. We did anyway. We carved them into the boards behind the bunks. Not our new names. If it's there, I'll find it, Emery said. If it isn't, we'll make a new place to put them. Tessa's mouth did something like a smile, and then flattened again, like it remembered it had permission only in small doses. There was a man who wanted us quiet. Not the driver, not the teacher, the one who came later and made the quiet feel like a blanket that was getting heavier every time you breathed. People called him Father in whispers, but he wasn't one. The teacher called him by a different name when she thought we were asleep. What name? Tessa shook her head. It's right there. It won't come. Like when a word sticks just out of reach and you feel your mouth grabbing at air. She looked at the ceiling again. I remember another thing. Sometimes, before we went to bed, someone would stand in the doorway and say, "The lake isn't ready for you yet," like we were bread. Emery sat with that until it stopped trying to dress itself up as a metaphor. Bread isn't a bad way to think about people if what you want is something that obeys heat. Before she left the hospital, she called the state lab lead and pushed him to log every surface for latent prints, even if the water and ears argued with her. He said he would. She asked for a full image of the interior, from headliner to floor, with rulers and color cards on every shot. He said he would. She asked him to treat the bus like a church. He didn't say anything to that, and she didn't. Pushed out at her office, she cleared the whiteboard that had carried parade duty. Assignments and a list of potholes citizens had called in 3 times each. She wrote 15 names she didn't have to look up. She drew a line under them for the driver, a line under that for the substitute, and wrote 2 words in block letters that looked like somebody else's hand. W.H. Rust. Ross leaned in the doorway with coffee that was technically for her and sugar she'd quit 2 elections back. He watched the names appear like he was reading a memorial that had somehow put its letters on the inside of his chest. "You're going to reopen it," he said. "I already did," she said, and pointed at the word "reopened" stamped in red across the case folder like a dare she planned to answer. She called Portland, PD for a contact on Gilbert Ashby, the operator. Put her through to a unit that handled crimes that wore suits. A detective with a voice that smiled and teeth that didn't set up a callback for late that afternoon. "You're swimming in a river with a lot of old logs in it," he said. "Watch your ankles." "I'll watch theirs," she said, and hung up before she let him hand her a flashlight she could find on her own. Evening leaned its shoulder against the windows when Ross rang again. "You're going to want to come back to the site." He sighed. We started photographing the rear panels. There's something tucked in a seam above window 14. It's thin and looks like a photo sleeve got married to a secret. "I'm 10 minutes out," she said. She took the whiteboard with her in her head, the arc of names, the red stamp, the fork on the map, and felt the day change gears. Road to Stillwater was muscle memory. The trees had learned her windshield, and the lake learned the sound of her brakes. By the time she stepped under the tape, the generator was a metronome, and the floodlights made dew glitter like a warning. The tech with the square glasses met her at the rear door with gloved hands, held the way people hold fragile things they're about to let you see. "I didn't move it," he said. "I want you to see where it lives." He lifted his flashlight, angled it past the warp of the frame to a slim dark mouth in the metal above the window, a place a paper could have slid when a hand needed to hide it fast and sure. Emery felt the small hair at the nape of her neck stand as if someone had whispered. Her name from before she knew it. The tech breathed, not quite a laugh, not quite a prayer. "Whatever this is, Sheriff," he said. It was waiting. The tech eased a pair of tweezers into the seam and teased the edge until paper sighed out of the metal like a secret being coaxed. He kept the angle steady, gloved knuckles braced against frame, and slid a sleeve free a clear, brittle envelope clouded to milk where time had pressed it thin. Inside lay a single photograph, color still stubborn where it had no right to be. He didn't touch it. He looked at her, eyebrows lifted in that quiet question. "Are you ready to see it before it becomes evidence?" She nodded once, and he tipped the sleeve so the image fell into the pool of his flashlight. Kids, 8, maybe 9 of them, shoulders touching, lined up in front of a low building whose siding ran horizontal like ribs. The windows behind them were boarded from the inside. You could tell because light wanted in and wasn't allowed. The children's expressions were wrong in a way you felt before you named it flat, not scared or smiling, as if someone had told them to make their faces into blank paper and they'd done their best. She recognized 2 right away. Marcy with the overcut bangs and the chipped front tooth, Caleb with the cowlick that had fought 3 mothers and a gel. And there, center left, a girl with a headband patterned in calico squares, Tessa. Eyes wide, present and not dot in the doorway beyond. A shape stood in shadow. Tall, bearded, brim hat pitched low. Not looming, watching. The brim worried her more than the beard. Hats tell you something about a man's idea of himself that beards don't. The tech tilted the back toward her. On the reverse, in ballpoint. That had bled slightly. Someone had written 3 words in a tidy hand that belonged in church registers. The Gathered, Year 2. Not from 1986, the tech said gently, anticipating what her brain was already sprinting at. Emulsion is later. Paper stock watermark suggests early 2000s at the oldest. But the negatives could have been old, or someone reprinted an older shot. Or someone took this later, wanted it to look like before, Emery said, hearing the edge in her. Own voice and sheathing it. Chain it, bag it, print the sleeve for latent. They did the ritual scale card, frame, fill, tag, and the ritual made the world real enough to hold. She texted a single photo of the back to Ross. The Gathered, Year 2. He texted back 3 dots then. Who gathered them? She didn't answer because she was going to ask someone who might dot the hospital. Tessa sat propped with a blanket, like a small tent around her shoulders. Hair combed into a braid that made her look younger until you reached the ends and saw the years in the fray. Emery held the photograph at her chest, not offering until Tessa's eyes met hers and didn't flinch. Then she placed it on the tray table, image up. Tessa's hand came out from the blanket and hovered above the photo, like heat rising off asphalt. Her finger drifted to the building's blackened corner. "There," she said. "That stain. It smelled sweet when it was warm. Like the stuff that drips from trees, but thicker. It got on our sleeves and never came all the way out." "Pine. Tar," Emery said. There was a tar shed at Birch Hollow when it was a camp. Maintenance kept a barrel for fixing roofs. Insurance flagged it back in the day. Tessa didn't nod so much as soften, some inner muscle unclenching because a word had been found for a smell. Her finger landed on her own face, and she made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "That was after the first cold," she said. "Year 2, when they made some of us wear gray because colors were too loud." She touched the brim shadow. "He liked quiet. He said quiet made us safe." "Name?" "They called him Father when they wanted him to hear," she said, eyes on the photo, voice steady like a recitation. "But the woman called him by his other name when she thought we were asleep. Holly, sometimes Mr. Hall, sometimes Shepherd. I don't think either belonged to him. Did he come on the bus?" "After. He came later. He didn't ride on roads. He appeared like weather." Tessa tilted her head, face turned toward something just over the bed rail. There was a whistle at dusk. It made the boards sing. "Train," Emery said. "Old logging spur. The museum says they ran one slow freight a day until '91. Dusk schedule. They told us that whistle meant it was time to be grateful," Tessa said, and the word grateful landed like a tack dot. Emery took the photograph back only after. Tessa had looked until she seemed finished looking. "We're going to go there," she said. "Birch Hollow. And anywhere else this connects to. We'll photograph. We'll preserve. If your names are on the walls, we'll bring them out." "Be careful of the garden," Tessa said, a whisper, barely pushing through. They called a room that, but it was just a square with no light. They made us sit inside until the tallies felt like music. Who sat in there? Anyone who used wrong names. Anyone who asked to go home. Anyone who sang without being told. Emery left the room with a new set of words walking beside her, and the hallway felt a degree narrower. Back in her office, she called the county museum, reached a volunteer named Irene, who knew every whistle the spur had ever blown. "Last regular run was '91, like you said," Irene reported, pleased to be useful. "Dusk mostly, depending on fog." They'd sound long at the Birch Hollow trestle because the boards would hum. Folks used to bring kids to listen. She called the utility district and asked for Riverview's last recorded draw. "Nothing in years," the clerk said, more curious than guarded. "But there's a maintenance meter still active for a well house that's on a different line. Shows intermittent use, like someone flushes or tests every few months." "Who signs the checks?" Emery asked. "Cedarline Foundation," the clerk said. "Same P.O. box as the Ashby filings you asked about this morning." She printed a quick warrant request and walked it to the judge 2 blocks away. He read, underlined, asked a single question about scope, and signed with a pen that had his name on it in gold. "Be careful where the floor is soft," he said as she folded the page. "Old wood lies to copse the same way new wood does." She and Ross packed masks and Tyvek and batteries because mold doesn't care about good intentions. Dusk huddled in the trees as they took the spur road, the cruiser bumping over roots that had come back to reclaim the cut. Birch Hollow's sign lay canted in the ditch, half swallowed by sword ferns, the words Youth Fellowship hammered over. With a plank that said "Keep Out" in a teenager's handwriting from some year that had no idea which year it was saving itself from. The lodge appeared the way old buildings do when the world has looked, a way too long like it had held its breath, and then forgot. Roof lines sagging, porch bowed, boards gray to silver where weather had gnawed off paint. The windows were boarded from the inside. That hurt worse than if they'd been tacked from without. It meant someone had lived with the boards. They moved. Slowly, light low. The air had that sweetness Tessa had named, resin and something hotter, as if a flame had been here long enough to make a memory, but not a ruin. On the porch, under a drift of pine needles, Emery found a bottle cap pressed, flat in a ring of metal where a jar had once sat and left its signature in rust. She slid the pry bar under the door's lower edge and levered until the swollen wood sighed. The hinges complained like an old man arguing with his knees, and then the latch gave up. Inside was a gymnasium of dust. Their beams took the measure. Of old bunks along one wall, a long table collapsed at one end, peg rails with nothing to hold. On the far wall, just visible at knee height behind the lower bunk slats, were scratches that resolved into letters as the light steadied. She knelt and touched the wood with a gloved knuckle. Names shallow and deep, some like a child's first cursive, some like a blade learning restraint. Marcy, carved with a little heart for the dot over the Y Caleb, each letter squared as if someone had pressed too carefully. Tessa, twice, the second time deeper, like a promise that wouldn't be erased. Between the names, words that didn't belong to children. Obedience, quiet, glory, silence. They had been carved over other names, as if the second names had been meant to replace the first, as if carving could overwrite what a mouth refused to say. Emery swallowed, and the mask made that sound louder than she wanted to hear. "Get every inch," she told Ross, and they fell into the choreography they knew ruler. Card, frame, exposure bracketed high and low. Behind the bunks, near the corner where resin had stained to floor black, a rectangle of darker dust marked where something had once sat for a long time and had been moved not long ago. She ran a finger through it and found, tucked at the back lip of the plank, a thin loop of purple plastic. She teased it out with the tweezers and held it up. A child's bracelet, faded into the color of old Easter candy. The bead letters had been rubbed almost smooth, but under the grit, the ghost of a K was still stubborn. Then an I, then something. That could only have been an M. She bagged it and kept her breath even. Upstairs, the rooms were smaller and closer. On a wall that had once been white, charcoal drawings scudded across in waves. Children in lines. A man with arms out, not menacing so much as enormous, face left blank on purpose. A bus with a halo of flame drawn like a child, draws sun rays straight, insistent. And below, a row of small markers, identical, marching away into the corner where the plaster had cracked from heat. "Do you hear that?" Ross asked, tilting his head. Emery held her breath. The house answered with mouse, spider, history. Then, faint and not from the house at all, a low tone like a distant throat clearing. She checked her watch. Dusk, a freight on a museum schedule. Taking its time across a trestle, it had no reason to hurry over. They found a box under a split table leg, metal edges furred in orange. Inside, damp stuck papers, and, wrapped in waxed cloth, a stack of Polaroids banded with a rubber that had taught itself to be a loop and then forgotten. The top photo was of a sleeping child, curled on a mat, hand under cheek, a strand of hair, stuck to a damp temple. On the back, in a neat hand that did not match the three-word caption from the bus photo, a single word, Dove. The next, a child standing with their back to the camera, palms flat against the wall, as if listening through. It. Back, obedience. Third, a girl near a tree, face turned away, left arm visible with a bracelet bright as candy. Back, disobeyed. Emery closed her eyes for a beat, just long enough to keep the room from tilting. She could feel the story trying to rush names, faces, rooms, and she refused to let it flood. The work would be slow, or it would be wrong. On their way down the stairs, Her beam raked across a sliver of mirror left on a nail and bounced into the hallway, catching just 4. A second, something that wasn't wood. A gleam by the baseboard. She crouched and picked up a metal disc the size of a dime with a hole punched through. A tag, maybe, from a key ring. The edge had letters stamped shallow. She held it at an angle until they rose up. RV2, Riverview Station 2? Ross said, reading her thoughts out loud like he always had. Transfer Station 2, she said, the words assembling themselves the way certain truths do once you give them permission. Whatever Birch Hollow was, it fed something else. Outside, the fog had let go, and the night had chosen clear. The treetops carried the last line of sunset like coals. She locked the door behind them out of reflex, and because the small act felt like a kind of respect. The air tasted like old sugar and iron. On the way back to the cruiser, she looked over her shoulder once at the sagging roof and the boarded eyes and told the boards what she was going to do next. The first sight had spoken. The next would too. The river that split but never rejoined was on the map, and the well house meter didn't care who signed checks as long as the pipes stayed wet. She drove with the windows an inch down, and the photograph on the passenger seat face down, the 3 words on the back like a hum under the engine. Somewhere between Birch Hollow and town, the freight let out a long whistle, and for the first time in decades, the sound was allowed to mean what it meant, not what someone said it had to. They were still peeling tape off their sleeves when the well house meter report came back with numbers that didn't belong to a dead place. Intermittent draw, small but regular, the kind of water use you get when someone shows up to keep pipes, from freezing or to rinse a thing you don't want getting dusty. Cedar Line Foundation paid the bill through a lockbox and never answered their phone. Ross leaned over Emery's desk while she traced the lines on the County G, eyes like a patient lifting a shirt to show a scar. Riverview's here, she said, tapping the north parcel where the river bent into a question mark. Old Camp, bought the same summer Birch Hollow, changed hands. Caretaker's waiver filed, and then nothing. The spur line used to run past the lower meadow. Ross watched the screen reflect in the window. We going now or in the morning? Now, Emery said, before whoever's flushing that meter reads tomorrow's paper and decides to take a torch to what's left. They loaded masks and Tyvek suits and batteries until the cruiser groaned like a pack animal. The drive worked its way from asphalt to cracked chip seal to a 2-track with grass high enough to hiss at the doors. A sign that had once been cheerful Riverview Youth Retreat leaned against its own posts, private stenciled over in a decisive hand. Fog clung low in the meadow by habit, even though the sky had gone clear. The river talked to itself along. The far tree line, they parked at the old gate and walked in to keep the engine noise from spooking whatever didn't want to be remembered. The first building that showed itself was the pump house, a concrete cube with a tin hat perched on a Y slab at the edge of a gravel pad that weeds had made their home. The padlock was new. That detail always sat wrong in the high-fresh metal on tired wood. Emery ran a knuckle along its shackle. The crook was slick, not with rain, but with the grease of a hand that wasn't afraid of being seen. Photo, then. We cut it, she said. Ross shot the hinge and the hasp and the shadows of their shoulders. Emery clipped the shackle with the bolt cutter's mouth and caught the lock before it hit the concrete. Inside, the air smelled like iron and bleach. A utility light hummed on at the pull of a chain, casting the room into the pallet of a refrigerator. A panel with a mechanical timer ticked softly to itself. A clipboard hung on a nail beside the pressure tank. She lifted it into the light. Dates marched down the page, months apart, initials that never repeated. The last line read, Flush plus purge, 30 min. Okay. A note below in smaller print. Use scent neutral bleach only. The handwriting stood upright and tidy. This was what careful people's fear looks like on paper. Someone is curating a ghost, Ross said. Or waiting for one to come home, Emery said, more to the room than to him. The lodge at Riverview didn't look like Birch Hollow's long, low beast. It had been poured into the hillside, concrete and block, and the stubbornness of a place that doesn't catch easy. The front door sat in a recess, like a mouth trying to take back a word. The hinges had rusted in handsome blooms, but the swing still held when Ross coaxed it with a bar. The smell that came out wasn't rot. It was old air and something like the sweetness Tessa had named, wrapped around the sharpness she hadn't had a word for. Bleach and resin, sap and cleanser, childhood, and its erasers. They stepped into a corridor half lit by the last press of day. Numbers stenciled in black marked doors on the right. A1, A2, A3. On the left, a larger door carried a placard held by 2 screws and pried. Garden. It read in a font meant to reassure. The handle didn't care for their touch. It refused twice, and then yielded, slow enough to be rude. Inside, the room didn't try to be anything but a box. No windows. Low ceiling. Concrete walls that had sweated and dried and sweated again, so many seasons that salt freckles dotted the paint. Their beams swept across tallies, scratched in clusters, 5s and 5s and 5s, ascending from ankle height to shoulder and on, up to where the ceiling first shadowed. Some lines ran true, some wobbled like the hand that made them had waited too long to eat. Between the tallies, prayers that weren't, copied phrases in a child's patient script. We are made safe by silence. Memory is the door. Do not open the door. Here and there, the phrases were crossed out with a fury that tore the paint. Under one, the faintest etch in a different hand. Real names only. Emery reached out and laid her gloved palm flat where the words had bitten. The concrete held its temperature the way a story holds its shape, even when you try to flatten it. Photograph the grid, she said. Top to bottom, every wall, no stitch later. In the back corner, half buried under a crumble of plaster, something plastic caught the light. Ross brushed dust away with a soft brush until a small rectangle showed itself pale blue, with a cracked wheel and a tape window occluded by time. A mini recorder sheep, the kind you buy at a pharmacy on the way to an appointment you don't want to forget. The case was scarred with lines like someone had worried it with a nail. When Emery tilted it, the scratches resolved into letters. Cut patiently, one after another, across the plastic, for the ones who remember. She didn't let her breath change. Bag it, she said. Lab only. Don't even look for a battery. They moved back into the corridor and tried the room's marked bunks, 2 to a side. Shelves along the far wall with numbered cubbies. In several of the rooms, names had been painted directly onto the wood in the same tidy hand that wrote on the clipboard, then sanded, then painted again. But ghosts of letters swam under the latex, dove, glory, quiet, silence, when she brushed the grain with the back of her knuckle. Other letters lifted under the paint like bones beneath a bruise. Tessa, under quiet, Caleb, under obedience, Kimmy, under silence. In A3, a line of small hooks bore metal tags, the size of quarters, each stamped with an RV and a number. 2 hooks were empty. Under the hooks, a card on a string had been thumbtacked, and then cut free, leaving the corners in place like quotation marks. On the wall above, someone had written in pencil and later tried to wash it off. New names are borrowed. Real names are ours. Who told them that? Ross asked. Someone they trusted long enough to listen, she said. Someone who had to say it quiet. Past the A rooms, the corridor opened into a common space that had forgotten how to be common. Benches were stacked in a nervous pile. A chalkboard wore the last day It had been asked to hold anything columns-headed gratitudes. Tuesday. Underneath, stew, safe, quiet, lessons. Someone had written in a different chalk, lighter, right at the bottom, where an adult hand might not stoop to read. River Sound. She photographed the board before she let herself erase the words with her sleeve and take a rub of the slate to see if older chalk would ghost up. It did. Under the scrubbed lines, a grid bloomed. Days crossed out, then recopied. A limping week that kept starting over. Tuesday. There was an office with a desk that didn't mind showing its secrets. In a drawer, penciled schedules listed shifts and lessons, the names of whoever taught them stripped down to titles. Shepherd Evening Prayer, Matron Lights, Caretaker Flush. On the back of one page, a list of purchase orders. Uniforms. Gray, brushes, soft, bleach, unscented, notebooks, plain, belts, nylon. And at the bottom, a single line in ink that didn't match. Transfer day to TS2. Pack only what's given. When the word transfer sat itself beside the tag in her pocket, it read RV2. Emery felt the thread in her chest draw a little tighter. As if the map inside her had just dotted a new line it had been trying to show her all along. "We're not at the end of a road," she said. "We're at a junction." They worked the back hall last. The concrete sweated there in a more purposeful way, as if the hill pressed in with intent. A set of shelves along one wall held boxes. Of curriculum, as if erasing a child's name could be lesson planned. She lifted a book from the top and opened it. Typed passages interleaved with handwriting that walked the line between sermon and schoolroom. Obedience is safety. Memory is danger. Your new name is a gift. In the margins, in a different hand and a softer pencil, small additions. Real names are bigger than rooms. The river says otherwise. T is my first letter. Behind the shelves, acoustics changed. It's a trick you learn by accident, how a wall that ought to sit over dirt sounds if it's hiding a breath. Emery rapped the block with the butt of her flashlight, and the sound came back hollower than solid ought to be. She set the book down, dragged the shelves out 3 inches, then 6. Behind them, scenes in the cinder block didn't line up. A rectangle. A wall had been mortared in like a patch after a bad decision. Ross slid a pry bar into a level line and leaned. The patch argued and then let go, dropping grit and a smell like air that has been polite for too long. Beyond, a short corridor sloped down. They angled their beams and saw metal at the end. A door with a wheel, submarine style, paint gone to chalk. On the face, stenciled letters had flaked away, but left their absence behind. You could read them. Because your brain insisted C's-2 ... her mouth found the word before she could stop it. "Transfer station," she said, not quite aloud. The wheel resisted, then grudged a quarter turn, then a half. Ross set his shoulder under it and made a sound teeth make when you pull a nail with your bare hands. The seal broke with a sigh that felt indecent and necessary. Cold air slipped around their ankles and up their sleeves. The corridor beyond ran just long enough to make your breath count, then opened into a room domed at the top. A shape poured to keep voices inside. The middle of the floor held a circle of small desks facing inward like petals around a knot. On each desk, a metal plate had been riveted. The plates had been sanded, but not enough. Names glimmered under the flat light like fish you can see. If you're patient, 5-letter, 4-letter, some with the same first letter. A few were untouched, their paint a little too new dot at the center of the circle. Under a glass dome that cracked along one edge sat a book, not the typed curriculum from the shelf. This one had a black cover rubbed thin at the corners, and the kind of spine that opens to the same pages by habit. Emery slid on a fresh pair of gloves and lifted the dome like a cloche. The book inside smelled like old paste and kept breath. She opened to the first page. A title in a hand, determined to look official. Final curriculum. The first lesson, gratitude for quiet. The second, new names are shelter. The third, memory is the infection. Correction is the cure. And under that, in tiny letters written so faint, they hid unless you tilted the page. C starts mine. Don't. Take it dot. She turned pages. The margins grew wilder. Hands changed. A line of ink scored through a paragraph and rewrote it in a voice that did not agree. At the back, a piece of paper taped in with a strip of old bandage. It showed 3 charcoal trees that looked more like stone than wood, a river forked with. One branch that never found the other again, and at the bend, a circle marked with an X drawn hard enough to tear. Below it, 5 letters written over and over, as if the maker had wanted to make the pencil forget everything else it knew. Kasha, Ross, stood at the doorway, eyes on the threshold, as if he expected the air itself to argue with them for getting this far. Hear that? He said again, softer. Emery listened. The river fussed outside. The building took its old creaks. Somewhere deep, air moved the way it does in places that have other places attached. And then, so faint that the mind might have called it artifact if the body hadn't believed it first, the whisper of something sliding across concrete or cloth against frame. Not near, not in the domed room. Not the kind of sound a raccoon makes when it gives up and leaves. A human sound, cautious, the way you test the world when you haven't been invited into it in a while. She closed the book without slamming it, set it back under its cracked dome, and let her hands drop to her sides to tell the room. She was not taking anything that didn't belong to the time. It would be safer to take it. We're not alone, she said, not fear but fact. The corridor behind them breathed once, like a sleeping thing turning over. Back out slow? Ross asked. Back out slow, she said. Mark the turn. Leave the shelf an inch wrong so we can find it in the dark. And get me a team with ears. They sealed what they'd opened as well as they could. Respect can be tactical. Outside, the night had thickened into something with edges. The pump house set a gray square against a darker hill, humming barely. As she slid into the driver's seat, the freight blew a long line through the trees. For the first time since she'd been a kid standing on a trestle with Irene's father's hand on her collar to keep her off stupid dares, the whistle didn't sound like schedule. It sounded like a name being proofread dot at the hospital. A nurse on nights texted that Tessa had woken with her hands clenched, then slept again, with her mouth moving like she was reciting to a wall. Emery stared at the message until the letters, blurred and resolved, then typed 2 words back she would have said aloud if the nurse had been in front of her. I'm here. She put the recorder from the garden in an evidence locker with a note taped to it that said, "Do not play until cleaned," and underlined it twice because she knew what curiosity and machines do to fragile tape. She sketched the stone, trees from the back of the book on a legal pad by memory until her wrist cramped, then added the river and the circle with the X. She didn't write the 5 letters that had been scratched into the page below the map because the letters were already standing in her head and didn't need more ink to keep breathing. On the board, she drew a new line from Birch Hollow to Riverview and left its end unanchored, like a wire waiting for a second pull. Somewhere in the dark between the two, something had moved. Not a story, not an idea, a someone. And from the way the sound had carried, they weren't used to floors that returned their footsteps.